and welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my April wrap-up. So April was an interesting month for reading, I think. I read a lot of things in the first half of the month, then I got kind of tired out in the second half of the month, and I have sort of been in a mood that I'm just like, I don't really know what I want to read, so I didn't read as much in the second half. In the first half of the month, I did read some more things that were like kind of things that had like a literary side to them. Most of them were still speculative in some way, but just things that like leaned a little more literary than what I normally read, because I was for some reason really in the mood for that. And I was like, we're just gonna capitalize on this and read through a couple of the books that I've been wanting to read for a while, that have been on my shelf, and I just haven't gotten to, because it's not always a mood that I'm in. So got through a couple of things, which is exciting. Oh, I do have one DNF, which honestly I DNF'd in my heart like months ago, but I just never really officially acknowledged it, which is The Practice of Groundedness, A Transformative Path to Success That Feeds, Not Crushes Your Soul by Brad Stulberg. This is nonfiction, and like I love the title, and it definitely sounded like something that I would enjoy, and I couldn't get into it. I think I got like maybe 40% of the way in, because it's not like very long, and I just felt like I wasn't getting anything out of it. It's not that it didn't have like good ideas, I guess, but it just felt like it was rehashing a lot of stuff that I've heard other places and heard put better in other places. And it also felt like it never actually goes in depth enough with any of these concepts to actually be useful. It felt more like a book that was just sort of like giving you a list of like, this is something you should look up, you know? Which I'm not 100% opposed to, because I love having new stuff to research and look up. But as a book, I was like, I mean, honestly, the thing that I'm keeping from this is I took pictures of the like bibliography in the back, like the references, and his kind of suggested reading list, because I was like, honestly, that's the only thing that is interesting to me, because I don't feel like this book had much value to me other than directing me to other books. Although a lot of the things, some of the other books that he had referenced were things that I had already read, or I was already familiar with that content. Anyways, it just felt like it didn't really go in depth enough to like actually be useful for anything, and it didn't feel like it was doing anything new with the information that was like creating new connections or interesting ideas. It was just sort of compiling stuff. So that's why I was DNFing this. I also, before we get into everything else, forgot to review a book in my March wrap-up, so we're gonna do it now, because another nonfiction book is that I read Atomic Habits by, I forgot his name. Who's Atomic Habits by? By James Clear. So it is Atomic Habits, An Easy and Proven Way to Build Good Habits and Break Bad Ones. And this was a nonfiction book that I was reading for my Works book club, because it's not really the type of nonfiction that I would normally read on my own. But it ended up being better than I thought it would be. Because I felt like I thought that it was going to be one of those self-help books that's just like, you just have to try harder and grind more and like whatever. But it was actually much more interesting than that, and it was more so about like how to change your environment in order to support the habits that you want, and to kind of decrease the likelihood of engaging in habits that you don't want. Honestly, this is one of the books that I feel like the introduction was the most interesting part, because in the introduction he talks about the three levels of change, where the first level, which is like the least effective but the most commonly used, is to focus on goals and outcomes. Then level 2 is changing behaviors, which is like medium effective. And then the most effective way to like really build a habit is to change identity. So you incorporate into your identity of like, I am a person who is like this, or a person who does this. But you can't just like think your way into an identity. So he makes a point of saying like, you kind of have to backtrack and change behaviors, because what happens is you change your behaviors, and by doing so provide evidence to yourself that that is your identity, and that is eventually what changes your identity over time. That was the concept that I thought was most interesting and that I like talked to other people about, and the thing that I am going to take with me from that book, and I will apply that to different things in my life. The rest of the book, where he's giving more concrete examples, which honestly he gave way too many examples in this book. I was like, you can stop at like 2 examples, like I get it. It just felt like way too many examples. But the rest of the book that had more like concrete examples, I just didn't feel like were necessarily things that I would find super useful. But I think that might just be me. I'm more of like a concept person than like a detailed, like a concrete example kind of person. So the more like high level concept of how to form habits was the thing that I found most interesting and most useful to me. But it did spark an interesting conversation in our book club, so that was good. And it did definitely end up being better than I thought it would be. I guess I don't normally review nonfiction that often, but I had thoughts about this one, especially because I'd like discussed it with other people. All right, so we can get into the rest of the books that I read in April. The first one, I have I think 6 books here that I finished in April. The first book that I read was Freshwater by Aquique Emezi. And this is one of the books that was on my TBR clear out project for the year, which I am very excited about the fact that I actually finished a book from that TBR, because up until this point, all of the books that I have read for that TBR clear out project have been DNFs. So I actually finished this one, which is very exciting. But this is, I think, a really hard book to describe, which I knew it would be going into it, because the main thing that I've heard about this book is that it's a real weird book. And like, I agree, it is very strange in a lot of ways. But in this, we are following this girl named Ada who was born in Nigeria and then moves to the United States to go to college. But the story is told not from her perspective, but from the perspective of this other character who is this kind of God consciousness that also lives in Ada's body and like shares her body with her. But it doesn't really come to the forefront until Ada experiences a traumatic assault. And that is sort of what triggers this this God spirit to take control of the body in order to protect Ada's consciousness. And so we're following throughout Ada's life and seeing the different things that happen to her and the ways in which having this God consciousness that protects her in times of turmoil and trauma and distress, how it protects her, but it also causes a lot of other problems for her throughout her life. There's actually a second God consciousness that shares the body with them, so there's like 3 of them in there. And this book, I think, like, it is a very unusual book. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. It is very heavy. I definitely say, like, look up trigger warnings for this. There are a lot of warnings for especially like sexual violence. And as we are following Ada throughout her life, we're really following a lot of her relationships and seeing a lot of ways in which men in her life really harm her in just a variety of different ways. And then the strategies that this God uses to protect them, which are, you know, sometimes help and sometimes hurt Ada overall. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that what Ada's experience in like the Western world and Western medicine would probably be considered dissociative identity disorder that was brought on by a traumatic event. But in her like Nigerian culture, there is like this, having a like God spirit share your body, there is a like a folklore around that. And so one of the, I think, questions, I guess, of the story is like, should we pathologize something like this? Because there are other cultures that do not pathologize it and see it as like a natural thing that occurs, and doesn't like other this experience in the way that Western culture and Western medicine does. And I thought that that was a very interesting thing to think about throughout the story. I read this almost entirely in one day. I actually listened to the audiobook and I really liked the audiobook. I think it was narrated by the author. And it just worked really well for me to listen to it as an audiobook. It's a book that I don't know, I just felt like I couldn't put it down. And I also didn't want to, because I felt like anytime I did put it down and walk away and then I came back to it, I felt kind of disoriented. Like it was a book that, for me at least, I kind of had to consume all in one go. Otherwise I would kind of lose threads of what was going on. But as long as I stayed in it, I like was, you know, I was in it. I understood what was happening, but I couldn't really like dip in and out of this story. Anyways, I gave this 4 stars. It was just a really interesting experience, and it does have a very unsettling quality to it. After that, I read, hold on, it is at the bottom of this pile for some reason. After that, I read Wayward by Amelia Hart. This is a recent release that is sort of like a witchy book that is following 3 generations of women. The first one that we're following takes place in 2019, and she is in a very controlling, abusive relationship when she finds out that she is pregnant and realizes that she has to get out now, otherwise she's going to be trapped in this relationship forever. And so she has recently inherited a small cottage in the country that nobody else knows about, and so she escapes this relationship and goes to live in this cottage and kind of restart her life secluded from everybody else. Another perspective that we follow is then, I think it's her great aunt, who grew up in the 40s and is actually the one who left her this cottage, but they were never close. They never really knew each other. But we're following her when she is young in the 40s, and the ways in which she doesn't fit into societal's expectations or her father's expectations, and the ways in which her father and other men in her life, how they control her, how different ways in which they harm her. And then the third perspective that we're following is a more distant ancestor of theirs in the 1600s, I believe, who is on trial for witchcraft. Because the women in this family have a special and magical connection to nature. They all have, in various ways, connections to the natural world, and it is very responsive to them as well, which in some ways gives them power and in some ways makes them targets. And so this book, I liked this book. I wasn't super like emotionally invested in it, but I thought it was an interesting one. I think that it's a lot about the ways in which men abuse these women throughout time, but then the ways in which these women find their own themselves, find their power, find ways to make their own lives, like forge a life for themselves in the way that they want it to be, how they use this power that they have to create their own lives and save themselves. So in that way, I thought it was very interesting. Definitely there are a lot of content warnings for this. A few of the ones that I wrote down are for domestic abuse, emotional abuse, and a controlling partner, unwanted pregnancy, rape, miscarriage, and also just lots of stuff with bugs if you're not into that. But in some ways, this reminded me of a lot of other witchy books that I have read, because I think that there are quite a few witchy books that sort of follow generations of women who have magical powers. But I do think I like this better than some of the other ones that I have read. What this reminded me of most was A Secret History of Witches, but I definitely enjoyed this more than that book. But I think I gave this 3.5 stars. After that, I read Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. This is a near future dystopian sci-fi which has characters with superpowers. It is following two black siblings as they are growing up. One of them has these very strong and difficult to control powers, so we're following her seeing the repercussions of not having control over those powers and how she decides that she needs to gain control. And then we're following the other as events lead him to being in prison, and we're following him throughout some of his time in prison and then some of after he's gotten out. And this book, I'm not going to go too into detail about it because I just did a whole vlog about reading sci-fi and this was in that, and so I talked about it in that video. But this is a very interesting book that is told in vignettes that are very like emotionally formative moments of these characters' lives. And so we're sort of flowing between these different moments throughout these lives and then have these intense moments of emotional clarity. This is, I think, a very thematically heavy book. It has a lot of things around racism, police brutality, incarceration, medical racism, a lot of different elements to this. It's very short, but I think it has a lot to say. And it just was a really interesting read and a very heavy read. That was kind of the theme of the first few books that I read this month. That I was like, these are very interesting and thematic books, but kind of heavy ones. And another one that I definitely look up content warnings for. But I gave this 4 stars. Then after that, I read Greenwood by Michael Christie. Oh yeah, also Riot Baby, also from my TBR Clear Out project. So another one from that project that I've completed and actually like read it. And then Greenwood by Michael Christie, also from the TBR Clear Out project. So I was just doing great this month with reading books from that project. Anyway, this is another generational saga kind of story. We're following it's mostly historical fiction because it's kind of set in the past, but one of the perspectives is set in the future, but in near future. It's set in 2038, I believe. And at that point, there has been a environmental apocalypse, essentially something along the lines of the Dust Bowl, but like way, way worse and across the entire globe. And pretty much all vegetation has died, and the earth is eroding, and there are there's dust in the air that is causing all kinds of illness and lung problems for people, and is causing an even greater class divide between the people who are able to stay safe in their climate controlled homes with, their air filters and everything, and the people who are not. There are a couple of places around the world where some trees do still exist. They are very few and far between, and one of them is Greenwood Island, which is this island where there are these like old growth redwood trees, and it has become essentially like a spiritual resort where rich people come to experience nature and to escape the cities and the dust and all of that. The character that we're following in this part of the timeline actually works on the island as a tour guide, but may have greater connections to the island than she originally thought. So we are following her family back through the generations to see how each generation had a special connection to the trees of this island and how she ended up where she is and how this island ended up in the situation that it's in. If I had not been in this very specific mood at this time, I don't think that I would have finished this book. I really wanted to like it, which is why I put off DNFing it for a really long time, because I had started it a couple of years ago. I wasn't into it. I put it down and refused to really DNF it. So I'm glad that I did finally read it now, but I think that it was like the very specific circumstances that got me to read this right now. But again, a very like thematically rich book. But I think that it had some very interesting themes in it, particularly around, I have my like reading journal here to remember everything, but around like the environment and how humanity consumes and destroys nature, also about what is family and lineage. Really, it's following like generations of sad people living kind of sad lives and how none of them really know how to kind of deal with their own lives and their own emotions and other human, like have real connection with other people. I think that's kind of the thing, is that you see how through the generations of this one family, none of them really know how to really connect with other people and have lasting relationships. And because of that, like that is passed through the generations because they never teach the next generation how to connect, and then they end up having these very sad and disconnected lives. I think it also, you know, had themes around classism and privilege, and the thing that I found most interesting, that was I mostly thought about in the part of the book that was set in 2038, but the part that I thought was most interesting was talking about the gatekeeping of green spaces and the commodification of spirituality. Those are things that I have thought about a lot, and I'm like, I have no answers to, but because like I have gone to like retreat centers and things like that, whenever I go to them, like it's beautiful and I love them, but I also think about the fact that, you know, they're often on these like this beautiful land that is then inaccessible to so many other people because going to retreats is expensive. It also often makes that land inaccessible to people who live locally. It is something that I've thought about quite often, and it was really interesting to see those like ideas and conversations and themes come up in a book, and that was probably really my favorite part. And in this book, of the different perspectives that we're following, my favorite perspective was that like future one set in 2038. Probably because of that, just because I thought the themes of it were the most interesting. However, this spends the most time on my least favorite perspective. However, I think I'm in the minority for this because I read a couple reviews where people were like in love with the perspective that this spends the most time on, and it just was my least favorite, and so I think that that also kind of dragged it down a little bit for me. I don't know, this book was very interesting, but it was not very engaging. I didn't feel particularly interested or invested in the characters, so it was one that I was like thematically interesting but not really engaged in the book itself. So as I said, if I hadn't been in this very specific mood, I probably would not have finished this. And I gave this 3.5 stars, I think. All right, after that, the next two books that I read were also both for my sci-fi reading vlog, which will be linked in the description, so I'm not going to go super in-depth into these here. But the first one is The Last Quintista by Dana Barba-Higuera, which is a middle grade sci-fi set in a pretty near future. in which Earth is about to be destroyed by, I think, like a meteor hitting it. And so they are sending some scientists and their families to colonize a new planet. And we're following a little girl who is the child of two of these scientists. And as they travel there, they're going to be in stasis because it's going to take a few hundred years. And so she goes into stasis, but she has kind of a faulty connection to the ship. And so she doesn't like fully go under for the whole time. But when she does wake up from stasis, she finds out that things have gone very wrong on the ship, and an extremist group has taken over the ship hundreds of years ago and has been doing some weird stuff in the time while they have been in stasis. And this extremist group is trying to essentially brainwash everybody and remove any memory of Earth, so that when they colonize this new planet, they can kind of start fresh and give humanity a clean slate. Because if you can't remember the bad stuff that you've done, that makes it all better. And they punish anybody who the brainwashing is, well, not even punish, they just get rid of anybody who the brainwashing isn't working on. And so our main character, Petra, she actually does retain her memories because of that faulty connection to the ship. It didn't like fully brainwash her. And so she has to pretend that she doesn't remember Earth and figure out a way to save herself and maybe a few other people, and save humanity for what it is or what it was. And one of the ways in which she does that is through storytelling. I thought I liked it, but I didn't love it. It also a very sad book. And when I've seen other people talk about it, they have talked about what like kind of like a gut punch the book is. And to me personally, it was one of those books where I was like, this is really sad, but not one of the books where I go like, oh my God, this like hit me in the heart, you know, kind of feeling. It was just like a very different kind of feeling. I think that it was more about the idea of like maintaining, like preserving the memory of like ancestral stories, which is interesting, but not exactly what I was looking for. Because I was like looking more for something that was like more directly about memory, not about like preserving memory through storytelling. So I gave this one 4 stars. I thought it was interesting and it was definitely good, but it just didn't hit me in the way that I wanted it to. And then the last book that I finished in April was The Genesis of Misery by Nian Yang, which I was very excited to get to because I've been meaning to read this for months. But this is a very loose Joan of Arc retelling set in space with giant robots. It is set in this universe where there's a war going on between the faithful and the heretics. And the faithful believe in this, in angels and this like benevolent being that protects them from void madness. However, I think that it also created void madness. It like created and protects them from void madness. But it is this kind of madness that you can get from exposure to the void. It can create hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, and then eventually you kind of explode, like physically explode. And it is quite disturbing and gross, apparently. So our main character, Misery, her mother had void madness, and Misery believes that she is also void mad because she is having these hallucinations of an angel who is talking to her. Because of reasons, she ends up in a situation where she is trying to convince the powers that be that she is a destined savior, who they do have like a prophesized savior messiah who will come and essentially save them from the heretics. That's what they're supposed to do. There have been a lot of pretenders over the years, but Misery is trying to convince them that she is this savior. However, she does not believe that this is true. She is just trying to save her own skin. But as things go on and as she discovers more unusual abilities that she has, people start to really believe that she is the savior, and she starts to question herself as to like, is this is she pretending, or is she actually this destined savior? I listened to this as an audiobook because I didn't really enjoy Misery's voice as a character. She's kind of snarky in a way that I didn't really like, and it uses a lot of kind of modern slang and like internet speak that just felt kind of awkward in this context. I didn't really like it. So I listened to the audiobook, which the audiobook was certainly better for me. However, if you were choosing between them, I would not recommend the audiobook because I don't think it's a great narration. The narration is very flat, and there are a lot of times where I think it was missing like intonation and inflection and emphasis in places that it really should have had emphasis. So for me, it was kind of the only way to go because I was not enjoying reading it physically, and so the audiobook was kind of the only way in which I was going to read this book. But I don't necessarily recommend the audiobook. But I wasn't really enjoying Misery as a person. Like, I do not like her personality. But I think that this has some very interesting directions that it can go in terms of character arc and theming, because I do think that it has a particular conversation it's trying to have around religion and faith, and religious fervor, and you know, the pitfalls of that. I, before reading this, did not realize that apparently this is supposed to be the first book in a trilogy. I thought it was a standalone. This is also a book that, like, the further out from it I get, the more interesting I think it is. So I did not enjoy the experience of reading it, but I might read more in the series just because I think Misery's character arc is very interesting, and some of the thematic conversations that I think the author is trying to have, I think are very interesting as well. But I also was saying that I've seen other people pitch this as Gideon the Ninth meets Pacific Rim, which I have not. I don't know what Pacific Rim is, so I cannot say anything about that. Gideon the Ninth, I think, like, vibes and plot, not at all similar, but like character personality wise, I can see a connection in the kind of snarkiness. I also think that this kind of reminds me of She-Ra, the TV show. Not in vibes either. Like, again, plot and vibes are super different because this is nowhere near as wholesome as She-Ra. But it does follow this sort of destined savior who at first doesn't believe that that's who she is, and she has this kind of special magical connection to either alien or ancient magic / technology that only she can do, and she has this other like being who talks to her to like guide her and, you know, convince her to use her powers. For Misery, it's a hallucinated angel. For Adora, it is a hologram. So like, in that way, they feel kind of similar, but I wouldn't say go into this expecting it to be like She-Ra. I don't know if that's a comparison that will make sense to anyone but me. Anyways, this is a book that I felt very, like, conflicting feelings about, but I ended up giving this 3.5 stars as well. I'm realizing that I had a lot of 3.5 star books this month, so not like the strongest month in terms of ratings, but I still felt pretty positively about the things that I was reading. I liked a lot of them. I thought a lot of them were very interesting. But those are all the books that I read in April. I'd love to know what you read in April. How was your April reading? I heard from some of you during my on my currently reading update that April has been kind of weird for some of you too, so I'd love to know how it ended up going. But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.